The flight cabin was packed, every seat taken, every row filled with impatient passengers waiting for takeoff. The hum of conversations mixed with the occasional rustling of bags being stuffed into overhead compartments. In the middle of it all, a woman hesitated at the aisle, her eyes scanning her boarding pass before looking at the narrow seat assigned to her. She was visibly nervous, her hands gripping the straps of her bag as she tried to move forward without drawing too much attention. But attention had already found her. A man in a designer suit, sitting in the window seat next to hers, let out a loud sigh of frustration. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The woman flinched but said nothing. She tried to squeeze past him to get to her seat, her movements careful, trying not to inconvenience anyone. But the man wasn't having it. He shifted dramatically, rolling his eyes. "This is exactly why airlines should charge more for," he started, but a quiet voice interrupted. "Do you need any help?" The voice was calm, steady. The kind of voice that made people stop mid-sentence. The man in the suit turned his head, already annoyed, but his expression changed the second he saw who had spoken. Across the aisle, sitting with his arms resting casually on the armrests, was Keanu Reeves. A murmur spread through the nearby rows as passengers realized who was on board. The tension in the air shifted, curiosity replacing the hostility. But Keanu's expression didn't change. He wasn't making a scene. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He was just looking at the woman, offering her a kind smile, as if her comfort mattered more than anything else at that moment. The woman hesitated, still standing in the aisle, unsure of what to do. The man in the suit scoffed, crossing his arms. "It's not about help, it's about space. Some of us paid for comfort." Keanu leaned forward slightly, tilting his head. "And some of us paid for kindness," he said, his voice still soft, but carrying weight. The man blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. The murmurs grew louder. Then, without hesitation, Keanu stood up. "You can take my seat," he told the woman, stepping into the aisle. She looked at him in shock. "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly." But Keanu had already grabbed his bag from the overhead bin, giving her an encouraging nod. "I insist." The flight attendant, who had been watching the situation unfold, quickly stepped in. "Mr. Reeves, we can arrange a different seat for." "It's okay," Keanu said easily, already moving. He glanced at the man in the suit one last time, his expression unreadable, before walking down the aisle toward the back of the plane. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a slow ripple of whispers turned into something louder. A few passengers clapped, others shook their heads at the man in the suit, who now looked deeply uncomfortable. The woman sat down in Keanu's seat, still looking stunned. She didn't say anything, but the way her hands trembled slightly as she buckled her seatbelt said enough. Meanwhile, Keanu settled into a cramped middle seat near the back of the plane. He didn't complain. He didn't look annoyed. He just put on his headphones, leaned back, and closed his eyes, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and by the time the flight landed, the world would know all about it. Because someone had recorded everything. By the time the plane leveled out in the sky, whispers had spread across the cabin. People stole glances toward the back, where Keanu sat sandwiched between two passengers, completely unbothered by the lack of space. Meanwhile, up front, the man in the suit shifted uncomfortably. His smug confidence had faded, replaced by the realization that he had just been called out, without aggression, without shouting, just pure, undeniable grace. The woman, now sitting in Keanu's original seat, kept glancing toward the back, still in disbelief. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her breath was uneven, as if she couldn't quite process what had happened. The flight attendant passed by and leaned in slightly. "Are you okay, ma'am?" She nodded quickly. I didn't expect anyone to stand up for me like that," she whispered. The attendant gave her a soft smile. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes, kindness finds you when you least expect it." But kindness wasn't the only thing moving through that plane. Social media was already catching up. A teenager a few rows back had filmed the whole exchange on his phone, his fingers moving fast as he uploaded the clip. Keanu Reeves just gave up his first-class seat for a woman who was being humiliated. Absolute legend. The post was live within seconds, and the internet did what it did best, spread the story like wildfire. Within minutes, notifications began flooding in. Likes, shares, comments, people reacting with shock, admiration, and, on the other side, anger toward the entitled man in the suit. The man himself had noticed. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, his face paled. Someone had tagged him. His name was already trending, and not in a good way. His fingers tightened around the phone as he skimmed the comments. Imagine being this much of a jerk and then realizing you just got schooled by Keanu Reeves. Bro really thought he was the king of the flight, now he's the villain of the internet. The realization hit him like a brick. He had humiliated someone, thinking no one would care. But someone did care, and now, the world was watching. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, Keanu remained oblivious. He had no phone in his hands, no interest in the online frenzy happening in real time. He simply sat, looking out the window, lost in thought. But the storm outside was only getting stronger. By the time the flight landed, things would never be the same for everyone involved. As the plane cruised through the sky, the tension inside the cabin refused to fade. The man in the suit kept his gaze fixed on his phone, scrolling through the endless flood of notifications. His face darkened with every comment. Some were mocking, others outright furious. People were calling him out, dissecting his arrogance, dragging him into the kind of public shaming that never really fades away. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening into a fist. How had this spiraled so fast? One moment of frustration, a few careless words, and now the whole world knew him as that guy. Meanwhile, up front, the woman who had taken Keanu's seat still seemed uneasy. She kept her hands folded in her lap, stealing glances at the back of the plane where he sat, silent and content. Her breathing was steady now, but her mind wasn't. For years, she had dreaded flights like this. The looks, the judgment, the muttered words just loud enough for her to hear. It wasn't new. She had trained herself to pretend it didn't matter. But this time, someone had stepped in. And not just anyone, Keanu Reeves. The thought made her stomach tighten. Why had he done that? Why had someone like him, famous, wealthy, untouchable, gone out of his way for a complete stranger? He hadn't done it for attention, that much was clear. He hadn't even known people were filming. The flight attendant walked by again, stopping briefly. "Would you like anything to drink, ma'am?" She hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you think he'd mind if I went back there?" The attendant's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I think he'd be just fine with that." A few minutes later, she stood from her seat, smoothing out the wrinkles in her sweater, and took a deep breath before making her way down the narrow aisle. As she passed row after row, people noticed. The murmurs quieted, the glances followed her. Keanu sat by the window, his posture relaxed, his gaze lost somewhere in the endless blue sky. The seat next to him was empty now, his seatmate had gotten up to use the restroom. She cleared her throat gently. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves." He turned, blinking in mild surprise before a warm smile formed on his face. "Please," he said, gesturing to the seat beside him, "call me Keanu." She hesitated before sitting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." She looked down at her hands, exhaling slowly. "People don't usually step in. They just watch." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "That doesn't mean they don't care." She shook her head, a small, sad smile forming. "I'm not so sure about that." Keanu studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You know, I was on a bus once when I was younger. A kid was getting picked on. Everyone saw it, no one said anything, and I just sat there too." She looked at him, surprised. "You didn't do anything?" Keanu sighed. "No, I was scared. I was a kid too. And I thought, someone else will stop it. But no one did." She frowned, unsure where he was going with this. "And then," Keanu continued, his voice softer now, "the kid looked right at me. Right into my eyes, like he was begging me to say something. And I didn't. That moment stuck with me for years." The woman swallowed, her throat tight. "So now," Keanu said, offering her a gentle smile, "I don't wait for someone else to step in." She looked down, processing his words. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease, just a little. From the front of the plane, the man in the suit was still hunched over his phone, sweating under the weight of his own actions. And he hadn't even seen the worst of it yet, because at that very moment, a journalist had just received a tip. And soon, the entire world would know exactly what had happened at 30,000 feet. By the time the plane began its descent, the internet had already turned the incident into a wildfire. The video of Keanu giving up his seat had spread far beyond the teenager's original post. News outlets had picked it up. Headlines were appearing everywhere. Keanu Reeves' selfless act on flight leaves everyone speechless. Businessman mocks overweight woman on plane. Keanu Reeves' response shuts him down. Kindness at 30,000 feet. Keanu Reeves proves why he's the most loved actor in Hollywood. The man in the suit scrolled through the articles in horror. His name wasn't in the headlines yet, but people were already searching for him, trying to track down who he was. His Instagram, his LinkedIn, even his company's website, people were digging. The realization made his hands clammy. He turned, glancing toward the back of the plane. Keanu was still there, still relaxed, still completely unfazed. The woman he had given up his seat for was sitting beside him, engaged in quiet conversation. For the first time, the businessman felt something he hadn't expected. Regret, not because he had been caught, but because now, seeing the bigger picture, he realized how small and petty he had looked. The flight attendants were preparing for landing, moving through the aisles, ensuring seatbelts were fastened. The woman beside Keanu hesitated before speaking again. "I wish there were more people like you in the world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu chuckled softly. "Oh, I don't know about that." She frowned. "Why not?" Keanu glanced out the window, his gaze distant. "Because if there were, people wouldn't be as surprised when kindness happens." Her breath caught in her throat. The plane jolted slightly as the wheels made contact with the runway. The flight was over, but for the people on board, for the man in the suit, for the millions watching online, this was only the beginning. As the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers began standing, grabbing their bags, stretching their legs. The businessman remained seated, staring at his phone, at the endless flood of comments. He had two choices: walk off the plane pretending nothing had happened, or own up to it. The woman turned to Keanu one last time before gathering her things. "Thank you," she said again, but this time, it wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper. Keanu smiled. "Take care." She stepped into the aisle. Then, something unexpected happened. The businessman stood up. He hesitated for a moment, then turned to face Keanu, his expression unreadable. Other passengers noticed. The teenager with the phone was already recording. The businessman took a deep breath. Then, in a voice much quieter than before, he said, "I was wrong." Keanu looked up at him, waiting. The businessman swallowed hard. "I treated her terribly. I shouldn't have. And, I'm sorry." A heavy silence followed. Passengers exchanged glances. Keanu studied the man for a moment, then slowly nodded. "It's never too late to do the right thing." The businessman exhaled sharply, as if a weight had just been lifted. Without another word, he turned and walked off the plane. The teenager grinned, typing furiously into his phone. And just like that, Keanu Reeves didn't just humble the guy, he made him a better person. The world wasn't done talking about this moment. Not by a long shot. By the time Keanu stepped off the plane, the airport was already buzzing. The video had exploded online, and passengers who had witnessed the moment in real time were now telling their versions of the story. News reporters were already waiting near the baggage claim, cameras ready, eager to catch a glimpse of the man at the center of it all. But Keanu, as always, didn't seek the attention. He walked with his usual quiet confidence, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, dressed in his signature worn-out boots and a simple jacket. Passengers from the flight whispered as he passed. Some pulled out their phones, recording discreetly. Others simply watched, still in awe of what had happened. The woman, still overwhelmed, exited just moments after him. She spotted Keanu a few feet away, effortlessly blending into the crowd despite the stir he had caused. She hesitated, debating whether to approach him one last time. Before she could decide, the businessman from the plane stepped forward. His tie was loosened now, his posture no longer stiff with arrogance. He looked different, less sure of himself, maybe even humbled. Keanu noticed him and stopped. The businessman hesitated, then extended a hand. "I don't expect you to care," he said, his voice measured. "But I wanted to thank you." And, he glanced over his shoulder, as if embarrassed by his next words. "I want to make it right." Keanu looked at the outstretched hand, then shook it. "Then start with her," he said, tilting his head toward the woman. The businessman turned. She was standing there, watching cautiously, unsure what to expect. He swallowed hard. "I was awful to you," he admitted. "And I know an apology doesn't erase that. But I don't want to be the person who makes the world worse. If there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." She studied him for a moment. Then, In a calm, measured voice, she said, "Just do better next time." "That's enough." The businessman nodded, understanding that this was more than forgiveness, it was a second chance. A few feet away, a reporter tried to push through the crowd. "Keanu." Just a few words, but Keanu was already walking toward the exit, unfazed, untouched by the media frenzy. He had done what he came to do. And, as always, he didn't need credit for it. As he disappeared through the automatic doors, the teenager from the plane uploaded one final post. Keanu Reeves didn't just change someone's day. He changed someone's heart. The world needs more people like him. And just like that, a simple act of kindness became a story the world wouldn't forget.